I'm going to talk to you about Our Country's Good. What I'm going to talk you through for the next 10 minutes very quickly is what the play's about and its purpose. When you explain how you direct, perform or design an aspect, you have to be able to justify yourself. Our Country's Good, written by Timberlake Wharton Baker, and we're going to look at the playwright. It was written in 1988. Now you've got to understand a little bit about the 1980s, which you might be aware of. It was Margaret Thatcher was in power. It was a Conservative government, and traditionally in that period of time, Conservative governments tend to be very finance driven, all about the economy, all about capitalism, about buying, selling, wealth. That is their priorities. They're not what's called a socialist party, maybe equivalent today like the Liberals and Labour, but they tend to be very profit driven. Now, unfortunately, during that period, they don't tend to traditionally value the arts. They're not really driven by that sort of importance. Cuts can happen to the arts. So the playwright wrote in that period in 1988 because they wanted to make a statement to the government through the play saying, hang on a minute, do you realise that you're damaging society by not investing in the arts? But what the playwright does is use Brecht's concept of historicisation. Now, you will know from your prior learning that historicisation means placing something in the past with the purpose of actually making you more objective in your thinking when you're watching something. So if you alienate it and put it further away in the past, you're going to evaluate it, judge it. Whereas if it was something happening now, then you're going to be much more emotionally driven. So what the playwright chose to do was look at the 1780s. And in the 1780s, in Great Britain, there was a problem. And the problem was there was a big criminal class. There's a massive difference between the super wealthy and it's not even the working class. Working class are people who work in some form. These are what's called the underclass, which ultimately can become the criminal class. There was a lot of crime in Great Britain. Now, there was a problem with this, and the problem was that actually there was massive overcrowding. They didn't have the facility for prisons because when you've got a criminal class and all that crime, they need to be punished, or that was the thinking. But actually they didn't have the facilities. So what they'd done earlier in the 1700s and 1600s is they had sort of found a section of America and actually used it to create a base for the army and start creating a society. And they started sending their convicts there. But what happened in America? There was civil war. The British couldn't stay there. So basically that changed now. So they found a new plot to create a colony, which was Australia. And so basically they discovered Australia and came up with this wonderful idea. Instead of actually putting our prisoners into the prisons which we can't house in the UK, they were hanging people. You know, capital punishment was happening for minor things as such, like a woman stealing a couple of loaves of bread for her family, and she was being hung for that. It was just getting insane. These were not for murderer or rapists. This was for just desperate people who were hungry. So they couldn't continue to do that. So they decided, wow, we found this new place, Australia, Sydney Bay, and we can make it a colony. And we don't know if people will survive in this land. We don't know if it's going to be able, we're going to be able to grow crops or build things there. We don't know how it's going to be. So let's try it out with our convicts. They need to go somewhere. Let's do transportation. And the taking of convicts to Australia, that whole transition was called transportation. So, for example, if we go back to the example with the woman with the bread and the loaves and stealing for her family, instead now of being hung or imprisoned, which there wasn't room for, that she would be transported for a certain amount of years. These convicts could then help establish this colony, but obviously they had to be sort of managed. So basically the military and the navy would go along with them to create this new society. It was almost like an experiment. They didn't know if it was going to work, they didn't know what was going to happen in the long term, but they were prepared to give it a go. This playwright found this period of time whereby there was so much historical documents, because all the officers, all the navy and the military that went out there had to document everything that happened. A lot of actual resources to base a play on. What you have in a colony is something called a micro society, a small version of a bigger society. So basically, this place is a very good example of placing something in the past in order to study how society can be effective and what the downfalls of society are. So what happens is these convicts go with these officers, and what we see is them invade this land, take over this land, create a colony, and basically with the same principles of the British society that they would have been brought up with, but actually other things happening and them staging a play within a play. If I just talk you through the purpose of the play, all the key themes and how it comes in when you read the play, hopefully you'll be able to understand it more. So if we start with the first point that I referred to earlier, which is the value of the arts, the playwright, Wurtenbaker, was trying to criticise the Conservative government and saying, actually, when you watch my play, you will reflect on how staging a play, re-educating convicts, helping them express themselves better through language, and the whole teamwork and ethos that's created with theatre, plus the audience watching the theatre and evaluating and educating, it has value for making people better at socialising, better at communicating. So it links to here where they talk about theatre as a socialising tool. You will see some of these characters in Act 1 who are convicts from, like I say, the underclass. They're very defensive, they've lived in an aggressive environment, they don't know how to communicate eloquently, they don't know how to express themselves, and they're very almost animalistic in their behaviour. And what you see is when they start working together as a team and socialise and communicate better, then they become more civilised people. There's a quote in the actual play that makes a joke about the Romans and the Greeks. And the Romans, when they started their existence of civilization, they built roads, they built buildings. But the Greeks, one of their main laws were every citizen had to go to the theatre, because they believed that theatre was that valuable for educating. Also, linking to the education is the power of language. What you see in the play is some of the characters who don't have the words, can't find the words, don't know how to express their feelings, become more word heavy in their language. They could become better at expressing themselves, and therefore their relationships become more meaningful, and also their difficult times they can deal with better because they can talk about it. And it looks at how language, education, communication is an aid for being a better person in society. So there we go, it links to themes such as love and relationship. It's really interesting because obviously we're in the different time period that it's set in the 1780s, and obviously women are much lower status than males. So what you find in that is some very derogatory behaviour towards women. Also women in the underclass, to survive, didn't think twice about being a prostitute, needing to do that in order to survive, to get favours, to get food. And so it looks at actually also who owns who, how dangerous ownership is. There's various relationships where you see that. And then ones where it's built upon communication, trust, good socialization, and how love can actually be achieved in a much more positive environment without control and ownership. So obviously the top theme here is it looks at the brutality of the criminal justice system. So basically it's set in Georgian Britain, obviously they become transported, but that period, and Great Britain, who was great during that period. But obviously it looks at how convicts are punished. It looks at why they're punished, how they're punished. It is brutal. And for those of you that are historians, you will know from your studies about sort of the torture and the whipping that would happen to punish people. Now, it does link to modern day. It is didactic genre. It's supposed to make the modern audience think. And it looks at this awful, extreme, brutal criminal justice system, and it looks at negative treatment of the officers to the convicts, and it looks at how, if you treat someone so poorly, so badly, how can they be positive about themselves? It looks at, in prisons generally, should we be exploring reform? In other words, making people rehabilitated to be better citizens, or should we be harshly punishing them? And so it takes this extreme version of brutality of the criminal justice system and it evaluates how we should treat. And there's lots of debates amongst the characters as much as anything, but also that spills out to the audience's thought process, because it's didactic genre, about how we should deal with prisons. And the playwright was influenced by going to modern prisons and investigating prisons to look at, actually, we in modern society and in the British society still have major problems with reoffending rates when people leave prison, so they've not become reformed. Actually, some people joke that they become better criminals from being in prison. So they're not being reformed and made better. And there's been social experiments in prisons where they've staged plays and used literature and language and plays to bring cohesiveness amongst the prisoners, to educate them, to make them more eloquent, and that has proved very positive. So she wants you to look at this period in time, evaluate where we're at now, and see how we should move on in the future. If you look at all those purposes and all those meanings, it fits, in your understanding, you should be able to work this out very well into epic theatre. This is an epic theatre production. You will notice in the structure of the play, there are tiny scenes with bigger scenes. One theme I haven't put on here, which you can add, which is colonialisation as well. I've mentioned it, how basically Great Britain, being this great sort of society at the time, leading nation, were great at sort of exploring and Bagsying, dominating parts of the world that they discovered. So you can add to this and put colonialisation, because there's another character that turns up, which is the original native Australian, which is called the Aborigine. And anyone who really like watching films, I'd encourage you to watch Australia, the film. You get a real sense of what this character, the Aborigine, could be about by watching that. It's quite a good film that could help you visualise the Aborigine. And the Aborigine appears 4 times in the play and just randomly appears in a short scene, and he's almost taking an observational commentary about what he's witnessing by all these other characters, the convicts and the officers. Britain is always on about, in that period, we are great. And these British people refer to the Aborigines as savages. They see them as animals, they see them as unclothed, they see them as not civilized human beings. And basically they look down on them. And what you find, the Aborigine is a fascinating character because he often has the moral, wise, sort of moral high ground compared to the others. And some of his observations of these other characters are really poignant. So my next point is, before you start reading the play, is to actually talk you through the synopsis a bit so that you can follow it when you're reading it, and hopefully make links to all these themes and see it coming through, so you've got an overview of the play.